Welcome to Whispered Night, where we dive deep into the most disturbing and horror stories ever told. In today's video, we're exploring 3 of the most disturbing true horror stories that will haunt your mind long after the screen goes dark. From mysterious disappearances to real-life encounters with the unknown. But before starting these horror stories, please like this video, tell us in the comments which story you liked, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more horror stories. Story number 1. Emily and Jake had been together for 5 years, and their relationship had survived the hustle and bustle of New York City. The long work hours, the constant noise, and the stress of living in a fast-paced world were starting to wear on them, though. They needed a break, a chance to reconnect. When Jake suggested a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin upstate, Emily jumped at the idea. It wasn't just any cabin. It was located in a small, quiet town called Hollow Creek, deep in the Catskill Mountains. Emily had heard of it before, mostly as a place people mentioned with a kind of nervous laughter. Stories of the town's strange happenings had been told for generations, though none of the locals could quite explain the town's eerie reputation. But to Jake and Emily, it was just a quiet town where they could escape for a couple of days. After a 3-hour drive from New York City, they arrived late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, the forest dense with towering trees that seemed to block out the sky, casting the whole area in a shadowy haze. The cabin, which sat at the edge of a dense woodland, was rustic and charming, with a stone chimney and wide wraparound porch. "This place is perfect," Jake said, stepping out of the car and stretching. Emily, taking in the view of the looming forest and the silent cabin, wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the quiet here. "Yeah, it's peaceful," she replied, forcing a smile. They unpacked and settled in, lighting a fire in the fireplace as dusk fell. As they ate dinner and chatted, the oppressive feeling of isolation started to wear off. The cabin itself was cozy, soft rugs, wooden beams, and a stone hearth. But the silence outside felt too thick, too unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. After dinner, Jake suggested a walk to explore the surrounding woods. He'd always been an adventurous spirit, dragging Emily along on hikes and nature walks whenever they got the chance. This time, however, Emily hesitated. "Maybe we should wait until tomorrow," she said, glancing out the window at the darkening forest. "It's getting late, and it's hard to see." Jake laughed softly. "Come on, Em. It's just a quick walk. We have flashlights, and the trail's supposed to be pretty easy." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. They grabbed their flashlights and headed outside, the beams cutting through the gathering darkness. The air was colder than before, and the wind had picked up, whispering through the trees in a low, eerie hum. The path that led from the cabin into the woods was narrow and winding. As they walked, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle in the bushes made her jump, and the further they went, the darker it seemed to get, as though the night was closing in on them faster than it should. "This place is kind of creepy, isn't it?" Emily said, her voice tight. Jake chuckled. "It's just a bunch of trees and animals. You're probably hearing squirrels or something." Emily nodded, but she wasn't convinced. Something about the woods felt wrong. The trees seemed to bend toward them, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have, flickering just outside the range of their flashlight beams. As they continued along the trail, they came across a clearing. In the center of it stood an old, decrepit structure, a crumbling stone well that looked centuries old. Moss and vines had overtaken it, and it leaned slightly, as if it might collapse at any moment. "Whoa, look at that," Jake said, moving toward it. "It's like something out of a horror movie." Emily shuddered, staying a few feet back. "Let's go, Jake. This place is giving me the creeps." But Jake, always curious, knelt by the well and shone his flashlight down into it. "There's something down there," he said, his voice echoing slightly as it traveled down the well's dark throat. Emily's heart pounded. "Jake, come on. Let's just get back to the cabin." Jake ignored her, leaning further over the edge. Suddenly, he froze. "Did you hear that?" Emily listened, her breath held. At first, she heard nothing. But then a faint noise rose from the well, a whisper, soft and unintelligible. It was a voice, low and hoarse, speaking words she couldn't understand. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice shaking, "let's go." But Jake didn't move. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "Someone's down there," he muttered. Before Emily could stop him, Jake swung one leg over the edge of the well as though preparing to climb down. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "What are you doing? You're not climbing down there." Jake looked at her, confused, as though waking from a trance. I don't know. I thought I heard someone call my name." Emily's grip tightened on his arm. "We're leaving. Now." They hurried back down the path, their footsteps fast and frantic. The woods seemed darker than before, the air heavier. The whispering followed them, growing louder, though neither of them dared to look back. By the time they reached the cabin, both were out of breath. They slammed the door behind them, locking it tight. But the cabin no longer felt cozy. The shadows inside seemed to have grown longer, and the wind outside howled against the windows, as though something was trying to get in. Jake sat down by the fire, staring at the floor. "I don't know what happened out there," he said quietly. Emily shook her head. "I don't care. We're leaving in the morning." That night, they hardly slept. The whispering continued just beyond the walls of the cabin, as though the voices had followed them from the well. And when morning came, as they packed their bags to leave, the last thing Emily heard before they drove away was the faintest whisper of her name, carried on the wind. Story number 2. Jesse Thompson never liked working the night shift. As a 23-year-old student, juggling classes during the day and working at Walmart at night was exhausting. But what choice did she have? Bills didn't pay themselves, and tuition wasn't getting any cheaper. Jessie always joked with her friends that the worst part about working nights wasn't the loneliness, the endless stalking, or the eerie quietness of the store. It was the weirdos who came in after midnight. Walmart, open 24/7, seemed to attract all sorts once the sun went down. People looking for snacks at 3 a.m., insomniacs roaming the aisles as if grocery shopping might cure their sleeplessness, and occasionally, the unhinged. Jessie had seen her fair share of strange behavior, but tonight, something felt different. Her shift started at 10 p.m., and as usual, the store was fairly empty. The usual suspects came through. Older men grabbing packs of beer, teenagers cruising through the aisles for fun. It was around 1 a.m. when things started to get weird. The first sign was the flickering of the lights in the back of the store near the electronics section. At first, Jessie assumed it was just the faulty wiring that management had been ignoring for months. But when the lights continued to flicker, Jessie's annoyance turned to unease. "Great," she muttered under her breath, pushing her cart of newly stocked items toward the back to investigate. The electronics section was the creepiest part of the store at night. It was always darker, filled with large TVs that displayed static after closing hours. The lights overhead seemed to buzz faintly, adding to the unnerving atmosphere. Jessie quickened her pace as she approached the area. "Come on, just fix yourself," she whispered to the lights, hoping they'd stop flickering. But as she neared the back corner, she saw something that made her stop cold. A man was standing in the TV section, his back to her. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair hung limply over his face. He wasn't shopping, he wasn't browsing. He was just standing there, completely still. "Sir, can I help you?" Jessie called out, forcing her voice to stay steady. No response. Jessie's heart began to race. She knew better than to approach strange customers at this time of night, especially when they were acting this way. But something about this man felt wrong. She reached for her walkie-talkie to call her manager, but the static that greeted her made her fumble in surprise. The device crackled and hissed in her hand, completely useless. Great. Of all nights for this thing to stop working. Jessie decided to keep her distance. "Sir, if you need assistance, I can call someone for you," she tried again. The man slowly turned around, his movements jerky, almost unnatural. When his face came into view, Jessie felt her stomach drop. His eyes were wide, far too wide, and his pupils were dilated. His mouth was twisted into an unsettling smile that stretched from ear to ear. "I need help," he whispered, his voice rasping like it hadn't been used in days. "But not from you." Jessie's heart skipped a beat. She took a step back. I think you should leave." "The store is closing soon," she lied, hoping he'd take the hint. The man's smile grew wider, his eyes unblinking. "It never closes," he murmured. "We're always open." Before Jessie could react, the lights flickered off completely, plunging the store into darkness. Her breath hitched as she fumbled for her phone, desperate for a source of light. The man's unsettling words echoed in her ears. "We're always open." She quickly turned on her phone's flashlight and pointed it toward where the man had been standing. But he was gone. Fear clawed at her throat as she took several steps backward, scanning the aisles for any sign of him. The store was eerily silent, save for the hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of the lights in the distance. She couldn't hear any footsteps. How could someone just vanish like that? Jessie turned and hurried back toward the front of the store, her footsteps echoing in the empty aisles. She needed to find her manager, Jake, or one of her co-workers. Anyone. She wasn't staying alone in that store for a second longer. As she neared the customer service desk, the lights flickered back on, but something was wrong. The familiar hum of the store returned, but everything felt off. The shelves were stocked with items she didn't recognize, strange, outdated brands that she'd never seen before. And the mannequins in the clothing section seemed to have moved, their heads tilted toward her as if watching her every move. Jessie's stomach churned. This isn't right, this isn't real. She sprinted toward the back office where the security cameras were located, hoping to find Jake. But when she burst through the door, the room was empty. The monitors flickered with static, and the chair was spinning slowly, as if someone had just left it. "Jake," she called out, her voice shaky. "Where are you?" The room remained silent. Jessie backed out of the office, her pulse pounding in her ears. She needed to leave. Now she headed for the front exit, but when she reached the automatic doors, they didn't open. She pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but the parking lot outside was empty. Suddenly, a cold breath grazed the back of her neck. Jessie froze. Slowly, she turned around to see the man standing just inches from her, his twisted smile even wider than before. "We're always open," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "And so are you." Jessie's scream echoed through the empty store as the lights flickered once more, plunging Walmart into darkness. From that night on, Jessie Thompson was never seen again. Some say she got lost in the labyrinth of Walmart's endless aisles. Others whisper that she became one of the mannequins, forever frozen in time, her wide, terrified eyes watching over the night shift workers who came after her. But one thing is for sure, no one ever works the night shift at that Walmart without hearing Jessie's ghostly whispers, reminding them of a simple truth. Story number 3. In the quiet town of Ashford, Connecticut, the nights of September were always crisp and cool. The trees began to shed their leaves, and the wind carried whispers of the coming winter. For Jessica Miller, it was her favorite time of year. The town held an annual festival every September, with bonfires, hay rides, and pumpkin-spiced everything. But this year, things felt different. darker. It was the last weekend of the month, and Jessica had stayed late at the library where she worked. By the time she finished locking up, the sun had already set, casting the streets in long shadows. The town square, usually bustling with festival-goers during the day, was now eerily empty. As she began her walk home, the cool breeze rustled the dried leaves along the sidewalk. Jessica tugged her jacket tighter around her shoulders and quickened her pace. The lampposts flickered occasionally, but it wasn't until she passed by one that she noticed something strange. The shadows weren't moving with the wind. She stopped and stared at the ground. The trees' shadows stretched out across the street, but the wind wasn't causing them to sway. They remained still, unnervingly still. Jessica shook her head, dismissing it as exhaustion after a long day. However, as she walked, she began to notice the shadows behaving differently. She would pass a lamppost and the shadows would shift behind her, but when she turned around, nothing was there. The trees seemed to loom closer, and the night felt heavier, more oppressive. Halfway home, Jessica heard a faint whisper. She paused, straining to listen. The wind howled softly, but underneath it was something else, like a voice calling her name. Jessica! Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, but the street behind her was empty. Only the flickering lights and the long, still shadows greeted her. "Get a grip, Jess," she muttered under her breath, willing herself to stay calm. But her legs moved faster now, her feet hitting the pavement harder as she hurried toward her house. Just a few blocks more, she told herself. She could make it. But then she saw it, just ahead, where the street curved slightly, a shadowy figure standing beneath the lamppost. At first, she thought it might be someone waiting, perhaps a neighbor. But as she got closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. The figure wasn't standing under the light. It was inside the shadow, as though the darkness itself was holding it there. The street light flickered again, and for a brief moment, she could make out the outline of a tall man, his eyes dark and hollow, staring directly at her. Panic surged through her. She turned and ran, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts as the wind howled louder in her ears. The shadows around her seemed to reach out, stretching toward her feet, trying to trip her up. She could feel the presence behind her, hear the faint whispers growing louder. "Jessica! Jessica!" Her house came into view, and with every ounce of strength she sprinted toward it, her fingers fumbling for her keys as she reached the porch. She could feel the cold grip of the shadows just behind her, inching closer. Finally, she unlocked the door, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, gasping for breath, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. For a moment, the world was silent. Then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. "Jessica." Her blood ran cold as she slowly turned her head. The shadow from the street had followed her inside, and it was standing in the darkest corner of her living room, waiting. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of her name, whispered one final time. "Jessica." Our horror stories are over. Please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more horror stories. Thanks for watching.